Three grandmothers. Well, I'm sure that none of you are like Athaliah, who must be the worst grandmother in history, certainly biblical history, because this woman was absolutely unbelievable in what she does, not only in Judah, but within her own family. And so our subject today is Athaliah and Jehosabeth, contrasting mothers in Israel. And we met both of those women here in this chapter, 2 Chronicles 22. We met Athaliah, of course, in verse 2, and when we meet her again in verse 10. We met Jehosabeth in verse 11. We want to talk about these two women and to see how much of a contrast they were and the outcome of their lives and their work. And we're going to see some really very dramatic contrasts. Now, this story revolves around the life of one Joash, the boy king of Judah, who replaces his father Ahaziah. And you see, well, in fact, he does replace his father Ahaziah, but Athaliah reigns for 6 years over the land. You notice it says at the end of chapter 22 that she reigned over the land. She did not reign over the people of the land. You might like to have a look at the words of 2 Chronicles 23, which follow in verse 13. That Jehoiada gathers all the people of the land and they rejoiced. And in verse 21 of 2 Chronicles 23, we read, and all the people of the land rejoiced. And the city was quiet after they had slain Athaliah with the sword. So she reigned over the land, but she did not reign over the people of the land. And they rejoiced 6 years later when she was taken and killed by the horse gate in the temple. And Joash, the only survivor of the house of David, acceded to the throne. So this is the area of the history of the kings of Israel and Judah that we will be considering. Now in the north, of course, the king at the time was Jehu. His name means Yah is he, and he'd been appointed by Elisha to eradicate from Israel in the north Baal worship and the whole house of Ahab. And he does that very, very effectively. In the process, he also puts to death Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, who is the grandson of Jehoshaphat. We're going to talk a little bit about that family structure in a moment. Then Athaliah kills all of her grandchildren except the 6-month-old baby Joash, and he's kept by Jehoiada and Jehosabeth in the temple for 6 years, and then when the time has come, Athaliah is put to death and Joash is declared to be king. At age 7, of course, it's impossible for a boy of age 7 to rule anything, leave alone the kingdom of God. And so it's Jehoiada who rules the kingdom for some considerable time. We're going to see Jehoiada's influence upon this boy Joash. But it's a tragedy at the end. And how often do we find this in scriptural history, that you've got very faithful people like Jehoiada and Jehosabeth who are prepared to lay down their lives for the ecclesia, but in the end, the outcome is a disaster. It's a disaster because the people that they've brought up, in this case Joash, do not respond to what they've been given, the heritage that they have received. So Joash becomes king at the age of 7. He's totally dependent on Jehoiada the priest. Now let's just go back and review how all of this came about. Why is Athaliah in the ecclesia of God anyway? Well, of course, she was in the northern ecclesia because she was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, but she ends up in the southern ecclesia by a terribly dangerous and disastrous marriage alliance. So come back to the record of 2 Chronicles and chapter 17 and 18. And we're not going to talk too much about chapter 17, but if you were to look at the 17th chapter of the 2nd of Chronicles, you will see that it is a remarkable account of the success of Jehoshaphat, the great teacher of Judah, who deliberately sets out to do the opposite to what Ahab's doing in the north, that is corrupting the ecclesia. Jehoshaphat sets out to build the ecclesia in the south on the firm foundations of the truth. And we find that, if you read chapter 17, And verse 1 it says, and Jehoshaphat his son, this is the son of Asa, reigned in his stead and strengthened himself against Israel. Notice that? He strengthened himself against Israel. Why? Well, because in the north there was Ahab and Jezebel cultivating Baal worship. And he didn't want any part of that. No part of it. So he strengthened himself against Israel. And verse 3 says, and Yahweh was with Jehoshaphat, that is, he approved of his policies, because he walked in the first ways of his father David. Now, that should be rendered a little bit differently. The RSV has the earlier ways of his father, that is Asa, who's just died, and of David. So he had the two examples of the early life of his father and the example of David, his ultimate true father, as the king of Judah. And he sought not unto Balaam. Well, who said that he did? See? And when the scripture says these kinds of things, it's telling us something. Well, there were people seeking unto Balaam. Where were they? In the north. Okay? That's why he strengthened himself against Israel. But verse 4 says, he sought to Yahweh God of his father and walk in the commandments and not after the doings of Israel. So you can't go wrong, can you, when you read that section of scripture, that here we've got two totally different policies. You've got the policy of Ahab and Jezebel, which is to introduce Baal worship, read Nimrod, Cush worship, destroying the foundations of the ecclesia. And this is matched, of course, in the first century when Christ says to Thyatira, you suffer that woman Jezebel. And out of that came the Catholic apostasy, just as it had in Israel under Ahab and Jezebel. Of course, God destroyed the former, he's going to destroy the latter. That's why Jehoshaphat succeeds. His heart, it says in let's just read verses 5 and 6 of chapter 17. Therefore Yahweh established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought Jehoshaphat presents. They acknowledged the leadership he was giving to the ecclesia. They saw in this man a great teacher and leader, and they brought him presents to acknowledge it. And verse 6, and his heart was lifted up in the ways of Yahweh. That doesn't mean in pride. Moreover, he took away the high places and the groves out of Judah. And when you read on, this 17th chapter goes on to speak about the way in which he accumulated an army and wealth that had never been seen in Judah's history. You know, Jehoshaphat's army numbered 1,160,000 men. Judah was never stronger than at the height of his reign. But isn't it always sad that there's a but? And the but comes in chapter 18, verse 1. Now, Jehoshaphat had riches and honour in abundance. And he joined affinity with Ahab. You see, he got to a point where he felt that he was so strong, that he'd been so blessed by Yahweh, that he could fiddle around with Ahab and Jezebel and all. We can handle this. We're strong. We know the Bible. You know, we hold to the pioneers. We've got it all. Besides to marry his son to the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And that ends up nearly wiping out the promises of God to David. The promises of God to David hang on the life of a 6-month-old boy because of that stupid act by Jehoshaphat. And he's one of the finest people in the Old Testament. But he makes a foolish decision. And that's where it ends up. Absolute disaster. And what we have here in chapter 17 and 18 really is the two sides to Jehoshaphat's rule. And it actually is expressed in the names of the two who are married. Now, when it says here joined affinity, this word joined affinity in the Hebrew is chathan. It means to give a daughter away in marriage, hence to contract affinity by marriage. And it's used in that way in the Old Testament. So this is about making an agreement with Ahab and Jezebel on the basis of marriage. So he says, I need a wife for my son, my successor, Jehoram, and you have a daughter, Athaliah. How about we make this marriage alliance? And in the names of these two people, you have the two sides of Jehoshaphat's life. Jehoram means Yahweh raised. And that's the positive story of growth and development. In 2 Chronicles 17, his heart soared, it says, in the things of Yahweh. And he grew, magnified. Okay? Positive growth. But what about Athaliah? Athaliah's name means Yah hath constrained. And that's the sad story of decline that begins in 2 Chronicles 18 and beyond, and culminates in that disastrous record that we read in 2 Chronicles 22. So let's just have a quick look at what happens here. Just very briefly summarise it. 2 Chronicles 17, he strengthened himself against idolatrous Israel. He soared high in the things of God. He built strong physical and spiritual defences in Judah. He developed Judah's largest army, and he acquired riches and honour. Pretty good list, eh? On the other side, he was bound to Ahab's dubious political imperatives by marriage, unable to respond to the warnings of the divine messenger, Micaiah, who's brought out. He says, you've got a message, you've got a prophet of Yahweh here. They bring one out. He gives a prophecy, and they lock him up. He can't even listen to the advice of Yahweh's prophet. His army is defeated, scattered, and demoralised. He forfeits nearly all the gains of 2 Chronicles 17. That's the two sides. Jehoram, Yahweh raised. Athaliah, Yahweh hath constrained. It's there in the names of the nuptials in this agreement by marriage. Now, some of you will be aware, if not all of you, that there are 4 rulers omitted from the genealogy that is given to us in Matthew chapter 1. I want you to have a look at Matthew 1. We're going to see that there are indeed 4 rulers omitted. In Matthew 1, we read in verses 8 and 9, and these names, of course, are a Hellenised form of the Hebrew, so they're a little bit different when they get into the English. And Asa begat Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat begat Joram, that's Jehoram. And Jehoram begat Ozias, or Uzziah. And Uzziah begat Jotham, and Jotham begat Ahaz, and Ahaz begat Hezekiah. So the missing are Ahaziah, Athaliah, Joash, and Amaziah. So these 4 are missing from the genealogy. How come? Because it just goes straight from Jehoram to Uzziah. That's left a few out there. So why should this be the case? Why would God leave out these 4 rulers of Judah? Well, the reason for that is the marriage alliance between Ahab and Jezebel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Now, the actual history is this. Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, begat Ahaziah, who reigned 2 years. He was slain by Jehu. On his death, his mother Athaliah slew all his children except for the youngest, Joash. Athaliah ruled Judah for 6 years. Joash acceded to the throne aged 7 years and reigned for 40 years. And Amaziah, his son, reigned 29 years and begat Uzziah. So why are they missing? That's the actual history, but God in Matthew 1 just leaves them out. Well, because of the doom of the house of Ahab declared by Elijah in the vineyard of Naboth. Behold, Yahweh said through Elijah, I will bring evil upon thee, and will take away thy posterity, and will cut off from Ahab every male, and him that is shut up and left in Israel, and will make thine house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, for the provocation wherewith thou hast provoked me to anger, and made Israel to sin. It's because of that judgment that God delivered through Elijah on the house of Ahab. Because you see, the house of Ahab ended up in Judah, and it corrupted Judah and nearly brought an end to the promises to David. So here's Ahab's family tree and David's line and how they become mixed up. Here's Ahab and Jezebel. She's the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians. Ethbaal means with or near Baal. She never left him. She brought Baal worship into Israel, corrupted the foundations of the ecclesia of God. She's married to Jehoram of Judah. There was a second child of Ahab and Jezebel. His name was Ahaziah. This is the idiot who fell off the roof of the house through the ladders because he didn't follow the law. Remember? He was drunk. Over the edge. Sends for Elijah. You know the story. Well, actually he sends to the Philistines, to the Beelzebub, and then Elijah blasts him, and then he sends for Elijah. So, Jehoram, the second son, is killed by Jehu. His progeny was also totally annihilated. But guess what? Jehu destroys the whole family of Ahab, but it continues. It continues in Judah. Isn't that remarkable? God sends Jehu to eradicate Ahab's house and Baal worship, but it continues in Judah because of this foolishness of making an alliance with that house through the marriage of Athaliah to Jehoram. Jehoram, his sons are taken captive by the invaders. You read that in 2 Chronicles 21. And Ahaziah is slain by Jehu, aged 22. His sons are slain by Athaliah, and the only survivor is Joash, the 6-month-old baby. What a sad story that is. So why does God leave him out? Well, this is the character of the true God that Athaliah did not worship. Deuteronomy 5 verse 9, he makes this declaration. Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto the idols, that is to Baals, etc., nor serve them. For I, Yahweh thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me. So 3 generations of David's line are destroyed for apostasy and idolatry. 3rd generation. But there's a 4th. 4 rulers forgotten because of the edict against Ahab's house. And so Athaliah, who of course is not in the line of David, is included in that number. So there's the 3 generations of David's house, there's the one of Ahab's. So there's 3 and 4. For the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me. And so Yahweh leaves them out of the genealogy of Joseph to demonstrate he'll have nothing to do with what Athaliah created in Judah. Make sense? Hopefully? Yeah, so there's a wonderful order, isn't there, about the way God does things. So let's come back now and have a look at Jehoshaphat's family tree. And we can return now to 2 Chronicles 21. Now this is a terrible story. The early verses of 2 Chronicles 21, verse 1 says, Now Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers. Verse 2 says that Jehoram, his son, reigned, and he had brethren, the sons of Jehoshaphat, and here they are. Now, they may have been from 2 wives, because there's 2 Azariahs in this list. So Jehoshaphat's wife's not named, and of course he probably, like most of the kings of that time, had a number of wives. And these are his sons, Jehoram the eldest, and Jehoshaphat, being the faithful, true man that he was, said, My oldest boy will be king. He's the firstborn, he will be king. He'd married Athaliah. That was going to be disastrous for his younger sons. Because these other sons, Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Michael, Shephatiah, and another Azariah, were all destroyed. They're all slain by Jehoram, their older brother, under the influence of Athaliah. There's no doubt about that. She was the one that got Jehoram to slaughter his brothers. Kill them off so that they couldn't be a danger to her rule. She's the wife of this king, and she's going to rule, just like Jezebel ruled in Israel. Ahab thought he was king. He wasn't king. Jezebel was king. That's why she wrote letters to the elders of Jezreel to get rid of Naboth. She used the king's seal, but she never showed the letter to Ahab. She was the king. And in Judah, Athaliah was the king. She ruled, and she was the one who gave the edict, doubtless, to get rid of the brothers of Jehoram. However, God is not mocked. Their children are taken captive by the invaders. You read that in 2 Chronicles chapter 21 and the 16th and 17th verses. Moreover, it says, Yahweh stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines, of the Arabians that were near the Ethiopians. And they came up into Judah and brake into it and carried away all the substance that was found in the king's house, and his sons also and his wives. So there was never a son left him save Jehoahaz. This is Ahaziah of chapter 22 verse 2. So this is the one we're going to read about in a moment. The youngest of his sons. So he loses all of his sons, all of their family are taken away by these invaders. Who were these invaders? Well, have a look at verse 16. They were the Philistines and the Arabians. Which Arabians? Well, the ones that were near the Ethiopians. Now this word Ethiopians is Cush. This is not talking about the Ethiopians down below Egypt. This is talking about the Ethiopians to the east, the Cushites to the east. This is the original Cush. What did that produce? Well, Cush and Nimrod and Semiramis, the religion that Ahab and Jezebel brought into Israel. Baal worship. Baal comes from Bel. Bel is the name of Cush, the father of Nimrod. See, God always brings judgment poetically. So he brings in the Arabians who live next door to the Cushites, the home of the very religion that had corrupted Israel and was now corrupting Judah. You don't get away with anything. You make stupid decisions, you end up suffering poetically. That's what happens. So that's the clear message of this disastrous period in Judah's history. And David's line's almost totally destroyed. Now we read the record of 2 Chronicles 22. In verse 2 we read this: 42 years old was Ahaziah. Some of you will have this corrected. In fact, it was impossible for him to be 42. It should read 22. And if you have a look at the companion account in 2 Kings 8 verse 26, you'll read that Ahaziah was in fact 22 years of age. I mean, you just got to do the numbers. It was impossible for him to be 42. So he's 22 years old when Ahaziah, when he began to reign. And he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. Hey? Was Athaliah the daughter of Omri? Of course she wasn't. So why is she called the daughter of Omri? Well, the reason's given in the next verse. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counsellor to do wickedly. And this is based on the formula of Micah chapter 6 verse 16. And Micah 6:16 says this: for the statutes of Omri are kept, and all the works of the house of Ahab. And that formula comes from Genesis chapter 10 and 11. Because Cush begat Nimrod. And Cush was the great original prophet of the Babylonian mysteries. He was the one who wrote the Catholic Catechism, by the way. All right? Came from the brain of Cush. He was known as Bel, later on Baal. Okay? So he dreamed up the doctrines of the Catholic Church as we know it today, and his son, Nimrod, implemented them with his wife, Semiramis. Now this is what happened in the north, isn't it? You got Ahab, who was the son of Omri. And God says Omri was the statute maker. The statutes of Omri are kept. And all the works of the house of Ahab. So Omri creates the statutes, Ahab implements them. And he has a wife, Jezebel, who comes from the Zidonians, from Ethbaal, with or near Baal, Bel, Cush. Got the picture? So that's why the formula's there. Because here we have that pattern followed all over again in Judah. That's why she's called Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. She's not the daughter of Omri, she's the granddaughter of Omri. Why does God say it? Because his mother was his counsellor to do wickedly. So in Judah, the statutes of Athaliah were kept in all the works of the house of Ahaziah. Same pattern, all over again. And that's how Roman Catholicism works today, isn't it? You've got doctrines and you teach the kids and they implement it. That's how it works. The mother of harlots teaches the kids and they go out and implement it. So this is the pattern that ended up being in Judah because of Jehoshaphat's folly of making an alliance with Ahab and Jezebel in the north. Verse 4 says, "Wherefore he did evil in the sight of Yahweh like the house of Ahab, for they were his counsellors after the death of his father, to his destruction." And that's why the Lord Jesus Christ said to the Thyatiras in Revelation 2:23, "If you don't deal with this Jezebel class in the ecclesia, then I'm going to deal with you. I'll remove your lampstand." And they didn't deal with it. And guess what came out of the ecclesias of the 2nd and 3rd centuries? The Roman Catholic Church. Why? Because there was a statute maker there. You suffered that woman Jezebel to teach and to seduce by... What's she doing? She's creating the Catholic Catechism. Where's she getting that from? Well, of course, you're Nimrod. That's why Christ calls it Jezebel. And if you don't deal with it, then I'm going to take away your lampstand. And he did. And so the Catholic Church comes out of Christadelphia, just like it emerged out of Christadelphia in ancient history. So it happened in the past. I'll tell you what, if Christ didn't come, and he will come very fortunately for us, he will come very soon, but if he didn't come, guess what would happen again? We'd go back to the Catholic Church. Because we make silly decisions about who you're going to have alliances with. That's why. You've got to be doctrinally pure. If you're not doctrinally pure, this is what God does to you. Now, what we read at the end of chapter 22 is a very curious marriage occurs. We've talked about one marriage which was a disaster for Judah. Here's another one that was the extreme opposite. So here we start to talk about these contrasting mothers in Israel. And we'll come back to Athaliah in a moment. But just pick up verse 11, and it tells us about this other woman. But Jehosabeth, the daughter of the king, took Joash. Now Jehosabeth's name means whose oath is Yahweh. That is, she has made an oath to Yahweh. She's utterly dedicated to him, not to Baal, like Athaliah. She's dedicated to Yahweh. So it's an interesting name to start with. And she happens to be the wife of Jehoiada. Now she's the daughter of Jehoram, possibly by another wife, other than Athaliah. The way she operates would suggest that. She certainly doesn't. If Athaliah was her mother, she certainly has nothing in common with her. She's the only recorded princess to marry the high priest. That's interesting, isn't it? The only recorded princess, because she's a daughter of the house of David. So here she is. She's a daughter of David. The only one recorded to marry the high priest. She could not have been older than 28. There's no way. You can sit down with a piece of paper and scribe it out. There is no way that Jehosabeth could be older than 28. But she becomes the wife of Jehoiada, who could not have been any younger than 95. Again, you can do the numbers. He could not have been younger than 95. So here is a 95-year-old who marries a 28-year-old. Now, hands up any takers for this situation. I don't think anybody would put their hand up. So this is a really curious marriage, isn't it? I wonder who brought this about. Well, I think God brought it about. You know why? Because here is a daughter of David in the royal line who marries the high priest of Israel. So what's their son going to be, do you think? By heritage. What's he going to be? King, priest. Which is why the Lord Jesus Christ says in Luke chapter 11 and Matthew 23 that your fathers killed the prophets. Okay? Right down through, they killed the prophets. From Abel unto Zacharias, which perished between the temple and the altar. Now, we're going to read that record in a moment. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the last book in that Bible is the 2nd of Chronicles. The first of Yahweh's prophets to be killed is in Genesis chapter 4. The last prophet to be killed in the Hebrew Bible is Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. From Abel to Zechariah. Okay? Why does he choose Zechariah? Because Zechariah was a king priest elect. And Israel was about to kill their own Messiah, who would be king priest after the order of Melchizedek. So this is a story with wide ramifications. Little wonder God left the four out in Matthew 1, He knew what he was doing. This produced a unique son, a royal priest. Zechariah, their son, just happened to be between 30 and 40 when he was murdered. He was about the same age as our Lord Jesus Christ when he was murdered by his own cousin. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. So when you look at this woman, and we're going to see what she does in a moment, she's the absolute antithesis of Athaliah in every single way. So where does this all lead? Well, it leads, of course, to the salvation of this man, Joash. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about him. He's the ungrateful dependent, and we'll see why. His name means Yahweh fired. We'll see that's a great misnomer. But before we go into that, let's just have a look at verses 10 to 12 of 2 Chronicles 22. And let's just see the contrasting mothers in Israel. Verse 10 says that when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, killed at the hands of Jehu, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal of the house of Judah. Now, who are these that she's killing? Well, they're her own grandchildren. And when I read this, I cannot believe this. My wife is one of the most dedicated grandmothers in history. She's unbelievable. 3 weeks over here, I've got to put her in a hearse, take her to the cemetery. She's nearly dead. 3 weeks away from her grandchildren. Just can't stand it. But here, we've got a grandmother going around with a razor blade, cutting her grandchildren's throats. You believe that? It's just unreal, isn't it? Where would this come from? Well, Jezebel, of course. Because Jezebel did exactly the same thing to Yahweh's prophets, didn't she? That's where it comes from. And where did Jezebel come from? Well, Semiramis. Yeah. So it goes right back. Cush, Nimrod, Semiramis. That's why they behave like this. They hate people who have the truth. They hate it, even their own grandchildren. So they get rid of them all so that they can rule. So she's going about killing off her grandchildren. But, verse 11, God intervenes through a faithful woman who takes her life in her hands. But Jehosabeth, whose oath is Yahweh, the daughter of the king, took Joash the son of Ahaziah and stole him from among the king's sons that were being slain. That's how the Hebrew should be read. So while Athaliah and her men are rushing around to all the rooms of the palace and opening up and looking inside, if they see a child in there, they go, cut its throat. Joshua says, I've got to do something here. So she grabs the youngest child, the 6-month-old baby, shoves something over its mouth so it can't cry, and gets under a bed with its nurse. She stole him from among the king's sons that were being slain and put him and his nurse in a bedchamber. So Jehosabeth, the daughter of the king, the wife of Jehoiada the priest, for she was the sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah, so that she slew him not. And he was with them, hid in the house of God 6 years. And Athaliah reigned over the land, not over the people of the land, as we saw. So at the time that was appropriate, when things had quietened down and there was blood all over the floors of the palace, and they were going around scraping up bodies and putting them in the rubbish bin, when it came at an appropriate time, she got that nurse and they made their way across the temple. And they took this baby and hid him in the temple, and she raised him. She became his mother. Right. And she had her own child about the same time to look after. Zechariah, via Jehoiada. She's bringing up 2 kids in the temple for 6 years. Think about that. What a wonderful woman she was. sharp contrast she was. You know, it's one of those tragic things we're going to see if I get a chance towards the end here. I'm just going to show you briefly how divine poetic justice flows through this story to the end of Joash, who kills his own cousin in the temple, where they both grew up together, in the house of God, in the ecclesia of God. And you've got one killing another who he's grown up with. It's incredible. How can Christadelphians do that? How? Well, only when you're imbued with the spirit of Jezebel and Athaliah. That's how they can do it. And that's where Joash ends up. It's absolutely tragic where this young fellow ends up as a 40-year-old. 47-year-old, in fact. So let's have a look at Joash. I'm going to just give you a brief summary of this man's life without going into the details of the history. We call him the ungrateful dependent, and you'll see why those two words are used in this epithet. His name means Yahweh fired. It's a misnomer. He was never Yahweh fired. He was Jehoiada fired. He was totally dependent on Jehoiada. His first mention, 2 Kings 11:2, last 2 Chronicles 25:25. He reigned for 40 years, BC 835 to 796. He was 7 years at accession, 47 at his death. His father was Athaliah, Jehosabeth, his mother Zibiah, a female gazelle. The temporary kings, Jehu, Jehoahaz and Jehoahaz, all of course from Jehu. He had 3 or 4 generations on the throne of Israel in the north. And as we've seen, one of the significant things about Joash is his omission from the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1. So this is just a brief summary of Joash. So these two boys, Joash and Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada and Jehosabeth, grow up in the temple. It probably looked something like that in its heyday. And they used the temple grounds as their playground. You know why they were safe here? Athaliah never came anywhere near it. She never came anywhere near it. Not within a bull's roar of the temple. And the only time she did, she got killed. Because she heard the hubbub at the time of the accession of Joash. When the people shouted and rejoiced, she came, treason, treason! She came to the temple. And they said, get her out of here. Took her out the horse gate and slew her. So these two boys grow up in the surrounds of the temple. Joash, the rightful heir to David's throne. And the throne of David has survived on the life of a 6-month-old baby. Zechariah, heir to the high priesthood and the son of David on his mother's side. Had the same upbringing, the same parents, the same home. Terribly different outcomes. The accession of Joash, of course, is recorded in 2 Chronicles 23, and we won't be looking at any detail of that. Let's have a look at the 2 phases of Joash's life. Like I said, he was Jehoiada dependent. He was rescued, raised and found wives by Jehoiada. He did right all the days of Jehoiada. He was minded to repair the temple from the dilapidations of the previous kings. He declared his disgust for the desecrators of the temple. He collected large sums of money for the temple project. He was supported by the princes and the people. He successfully completed the temple project. He dedicated the vessels for the temple, and he remained faithful all the days of Jehoiada. Now, if his life ended there, you would have said, pretty good, eh? Yeah, very good, very satisfying to have a son like this. So Jehoiada and Jehosabeth, who've raised this stepson, okay, would have been pretty happy, but Jehoiada dies. Jehoiada dies age 130. He'd ruled the kingdom effectively, and they buried him amongst the kings because he had effectively been a king. That was the end of it. And the record, you have a look at the record of 2 Chronicles 24, verse 15. The last words of the previous verse, verse 14, you've just seen on the screen. All the days of Jehoiada. But then verse 15 says, but Jehoiada waxed old and was full of days when he died. 130 years old was he when he died. And they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel. Israel? You know, you've got to read your Bible carefully, don't you? What would you have put there? I know what I would have put there. I would have put Judah. Jordan never went anywhere near Israel, did he? Never. He was a high priest. He wouldn't go to Israel in the north. They were Baal worshippers. Or, if not Baal worshippers, Jeroboam worshippers. So why does it say Israel? There's a very important lesson in that, sisters. Jehoiada never had anything to do with Israel, physically. But because he stood for the truth in Judah, the whole brotherhood profited. Because he stood firm and would not move, all of Israel benefited. That's what God says about this man. And the same applies to us. He had nothing to do with Israel in the north. But because he upheld the truth in its purity firmly, the benefits of that flowed out to the rest of the brotherhood. And there were parts of it in Israel even who would have been affected by the influence of Jordan. Now what if he'd been wobbly and wonky and given way? It would have been a disaster for Judah and a disaster for everybody. Now, there's a very important lesson in that. So what about this man, his two phases of life? Well, he'd been rescued and all of these things we've just seen, but he succumbed to the advances of the princes. Look what we read here in verse 17 of chapter 24. Now after the death of Jehoiada came the princes of Judah and made obeisance to the king. Then the king hearkened unto them, and they left the house of Yahweh God of their fathers and served groves and idols. And wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this their trespass. So he succumbed to the advances. These are the princes that had helped him repair the temple. And then all of a sudden they changed their colours. You know, they were closet liberals. When things were going in one direction, they got behind it. Because this was where the stream was going. We're all in this. So they supported it. And as soon as Jehoiada was dead, as soon as the rock of Gibraltar was gone, they changed their tune. And they started to butter up the king. And they got him to change his policy. They got him to abandon Jehoiada's approach. Seduced him. They forsook the house of God and they turned to idolatry and refused to listen to the rebuke of Yahweh's prophets. And one of those prophets was Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada and Jehosabeth. Let's read about that. Verse 19. Wrath came upon them, yet he sent prophets to them to bring them again unto Yahweh, and they testified against them, but they would not give ear. You talk all day, they weren't going to listen. And the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah the son of Jehoiada the priest, which stood above the people. And he said unto them, Thus saith God, Why transgress ye the commandments of Yahweh, that ye cannot prosper? Because ye have forsaken Yahweh, he hath also forsaken you. So they killed him. Gave commandment to stone his own cousin, Zechariah, in the court of the temple. We read that in verse 21. And they conspired against him and stoned him with stones at the commandment of the king in the court of the house of Yahweh. He was sorely wounded by Syrian invaders. We read that in verse 23. Verse 23 says, It came to pass at the end of the year that the host of Syria came up against him, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed, notice this, there's always poetry. There's poetry in divine judgment. They destroyed all the princes of the people from among the people. Notice that? They went around saying, we want the princes. Not the ordinary people, we want the princes. Why? Because it was the princes who seduced Joash into apostasy. So the Syrians dealt with them. And we also read that they dealt with Joash. Verse 24. So the army of the Syrians came up with a small company of men, and Yahweh delivered a very great host into their hand, because they had forsaken Yahweh God of their fathers. So they executed judgment against them. And we'll come back in a moment to Joash's demise. he is assassinated by his own servants on whom he was entirely dependent. Let's just go back to that one. I want to show you just how poetic this is. Let's have a closer look at verses 21 through 25. 26. It says in verse 21 that they conspired against him and stoned him with stones at the command of the king. Remember what Christ said, Luke 11:51? O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that stonest the prophets that are sent unto thee. And all the blood from Abel to the blood of Zacharias, whom ye slew between the temple, shall be required of this generation. It's the words of Christ. It will be required. Read on. 2 Chronicles 24. Thus Joash the king, verse 22, remembered not the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but slew his son. And when Zechariah died, he said, Yahweh, look upon it and require it. See? That's where that's coming from. Now the name Zechariah means Yah hath remembered. The name Jehoiada means Yahweh knoweth. We've just read. Thus Joash the king remembered not the kindness. Zechariah, Yah hath remembered. He did. But Joash didn't remember the kindness of Jehoiada and Jehosabeth, who raised him from a 6-month-old baby. He didn't remember that. But Yahweh knew Jehoiada. So when he died, he said, Yahweh, look upon it. That word look is the Hebrew word ra'ah. R-A-A-H. You know what it means? To see. To see. Yahweh see and require it. You know the name of the king that came against Joash? The name of the king was Hazael. You know what it means? God has seen. He'd seen all right. He knew. He remembered. And he sent Hazael. God has seen. To bring judgment. What kind of judgment? Well, he left him in sore diseases. You come down to verse 25. And when they were departed from him, for they left him in great diseases, that is, sorely wounded, his own servants conspired against him for the blood of the sons of Jehoiada the priest. Son, it should read, singular. Zechariah is referred to. And slew him on his bed, and he died. And they buried him in the city of David, but not amongst the kings. On his bed? Yeah. Where did this boy, as a 6-month-old, begin his career? Under a bed. And that's where he dies. And there were 2 women with him, weren't there, in that bedroom? Read on, verse 26. And these are they that conspired against him, Zabad the son of Shimeath, an Ammonitess, and Jehosabeth the son of Shimrith, a Moabitess. Now, when was the last time that you read about sons of a mother? The Bible doesn't do that. It's always the son of a father, isn't it? So why does God revert here and say that there are 2 women involved? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Joash began in a bedroom with 2 women. And he remembered not the kindness which Yahweh had shown unto him through those 2 women. So 2 women are brought out. And they happen to be an Ammonitess and a Moabitess. And the law said, Ammonites and Moabites will not be in the house of God to the 10th generation. So what are they doing here? They're foreigners. Now why would you think that Ammon and Moab are used here? Well, let me just remind you of Genesis chapter 19. What's the last scene in the life of Lot, the nephew of Abraham? Lot had forsaken the encampment of Abraham, hadn't he? He'd gone to Sodom, and it was a disaster. And he ends up in a cave, which becomes a bedroom with two women, his own daughters, and through them is produced Moab and Ammon. You talk about poetry? You got poetry here. This is divine, poetic judgment. Sisters, I think if there's any lesson to be learned from the record of Jehoshaphat and his mistake and the events that led to this disastrous situation and the death of Zechariah, high priest, king-elect, so to speak, anything to be learnt from that, it is as if you give ground on fundamentals, God will make you pay. Don't think you can escape. He will make you pay. That's the lesson we get from that. I've got one more thing to say before I... What happens to this wonderful woman, Jehosabeth? The record says they conspired against him and stoned him with stones at the commandment of the king in the court of the house of Yahweh. 2 Chronicles 24:21. What the record doesn't say is what happened to Jehoshaphat. Jehoiada is dead. Zechariah is now high priest. He's got in his blood the blood of David. He's effectively a king priest, at least king priest elect. And he's killed in the very place where they've been brought up together by his own cousin. And there's a woman looking on all of this. A woman. And her heart is pierced with a sword as she watches her own son put to death at the hands of another son that she's brought up. Think about that. What a terrible tragedy that is. But I'll tell you something. The day's at hand and the resurrection will occur. And standing together at the right hand of Christ will be Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat and Zechariah. But I'll tell you who won't be there. He'll be on the other side. Joash. With Athaliah and Ahab and Jezebel and all that mob. I know where I want to stand. And I think I know where you want to be. Sisters.